Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big Al Devlin video here at the House of Devlin. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be continuing the discussion of our topic of paganism by looking specifically at the subject matter of abstract concepts behind the existence, the origin, the expansion and the evolution of both the spiritual and material realms within paganism. Now, the best place to start, I find, when it comes to considering the realms themselves, is to really start at the beginning of time itself, the beginning of the cosmology myth that exists within Western European paganism. Now, at the beginning of time, there existed only two realms. Now, of course, those of you who are familiar with paganism will understand that, of course, there are 9 realms within the existence of reality that constitute all of reality. But at the beginning of time, there was actually, in fact, only 2 realms: the realms of Muspelheim, being the realms of fire, and the realm of Niflheim, the realm of ice. These 2 realms were found at essentially polar opposites, not only in their nature but also geographically in distance. They were split apart and separated by a vast chasm of nothingness, a great void called Gununganap. Now, the concept behind Gununganap is very important to understand, because when you understand Gununganap and draw parallels between that and our own expansion of our universe, what you do is you can actually fully understand and visualize the concept of how the realms expand within it. So with that in mind, let's fully discuss and understand what Gununganap is. So I described it as a nothingness, a void or a chasm of nothingness, and this is kind of correct but kind of not correct. The problem is there are no real words, singular words I can speak to describe it to you. In fact, I have to kind of go almost like a poetic way of trying to describe what Gununganap is. And it's important to understand what it is, as I say, so that we can understand how the realms expand, or certainly by then drawing parallels on how our own realm of Midgard expands. This is something that, of course, we have an experience with. And so Gununganap is an absolute nothingness. I suppose that's a better way of describing it, i.e. it is beyond nothingness. What I mean by this is that nothingness is something that you can actually give a value to. It's something that you can describe. It is in itself a something. Yes, that's correct. Nothingness is actually something, because it can be defined as simply the absence of something else. For example, this is the best way to put it, and it actually comes, this description, this explanation comes directly from the old Eddas and Prose. So it's quite an old understanding, and shows that obviously the concept of this Gununganap is very well understood and has been since pretty much the beginning of paganism. And that is, for example, silence. Silence you would describe as a form of nothingness. But the problem is, silence is, again, itself is something, because it can be described as the absence of sound. So it becomes definable. It loses that concept of nothingness. To us, it's a nothingness. It's an absence of sound. It's a void of sound. But it is still, on a conceptual level, a something, because it can be described and defined. Gununganap doesn't even have silence, and that comes directly from the old prose. Gununganap doesn't even have silence. It is literally a nothingness, something that we cannot describe, and something we could never really conceive within our heads, because we'll never ever, I doubt, have an experience of what Gununganap is. I doubt even the gods themselves could fully describe it, or at least put words to it. But I hope that that description in a metaphorical sense, I suppose, at least allows the concept of Gununganap to be understandable. Now, the reason why it's important to understand Gununganap is because this is exactly what the realms expand into. At the beginning of time, it is very clearly stated that Muspelheim and Niflheim expand outwards into Gununganap until the point where they meet. And when their boundaries meet, there is a collision between the realms. So we know the realms, when they expand into Gununganap, but they cannot expand into each other. When they try to expand into each other, there is a collision between the realms and an interaction that has consequences. Now, we'll go on to what this collision and the consequences of this initial collision between Niflheim and Muspelheim has in a bit. But what I will say now is, when we live in the realm of Midgard, the material realm, the only material realm that exists within the concept of paganistic reality, essentially. Now, Midgard itself, of course, has two reference points, and you'll find this within all the realms. For example, when you look at Asgard, Asgard is the name that you give to the capital of Asgard, essentially, which is where the gods live, the town or the fortification or the city, whatever you would describe it as. This is Asgard, where the halls of Valhalla, the fields of Folkvangir, the palace of Sessrumnir all exist. But Asgard itself, as as the palace of the gods, essentially, well, it literally means the garden of the gods. It's literal old translation. Okay. Also, will be an adequate description of the realm that surrounds Asgard. So the term Asgard not only refers to a structure, essentially, or a world within the realm, but it describes the surrounding of realm also, and this still applies to Midgard. When we use the term Midgard, we are referring to planet Earth, in essence, which within paganistic beliefs is, of course, the corpse of Ymir, the first of all life forms, actually, the first life, and the first giant, and the first of the gods. And his corpse was used by Odin, Vili, and Ve to construct the planet Earth, essentially, or the actual sort of world of Midgard. But the world of Midgard, i.e. Earth, is surrounded, of course, by a material realm, which again we would also describe as Midgard. The material realm being, of course, the universe that we can look at through telescopes, and with our own naked eyes we can see the stars in the sky, we can see the sun, we can see the moon, we can see evidence that, of course, there is things around us, there is a material realm beyond simply us. And this, as I say, can also be described as Midgard. Now, the reason why I wanted to consider Gununganap early on is because, as I say, we've seen that the realms expand into Gununganap. This is the thing that they naturally do. They want to expand to fill whatever space they have around them, until, of course, they come into something they cannot collide with. Now, on the spiritual realm sense, these realms are in essentially the same plane as one another, so the spiritual realms expand until they contact one another and, as I say, collide. But we, Midgard, are a realm that is in sole possession of the quality of material. There are no other material realms, at least not that we know of. And so Midgard, or the universe, as it expands, we know that it is expanding, right? It's accelerating in its expansion, right? Redshift and all that, okay? We're not going to go into physics, but we know scientifically the universe is expanding at an ever-accelerating rate. And one of the questions that people within the scientific community ask is, well, what is the universe expanding into? And ultimately, the answer to this is, well, the universe is expanding into a nothingness that then it creates itself within this nothingness to then create a reality. i.e., the universe is creating itself, but into essentially a boundless nothingness beyond it. Now, to most people, of course, the universe, i.e. the void of the universe, the spaces between planets, stars, so on and so forth, that is nothingness to most people, because there's no sound. Yes, you can see the stars and stuff, but in essence, that's a kind of nothingness. But it isn't. It's actually very much a reality. Okay, and what the universe of Midgard, or our universe, is expanding into, that's the real nothingness. That's the absolute nothingness of Gununganap, which I previously described. So the material universe, because it's on its own plane, it can expand into Gununganap and will continue expanding because it will never come into collision with anything else, unlike the spiritual realms. However, there is potentially a border to which Midgard can expand into, because Midgard is, in the old belief system, surrounded by water. Now, most people would probably discuss this water, or conceive this water, as being literal, that the Vikings and the ancient Nordic people and the Celts and that believed that they were surrounded by water because, of course, the coasts, and they lived off the sea, a lot of them, and they obviously, it was vast. It was expanse, vast expanse, the seas and the oceans that surrounded Europe. Now, I think that's an oversimplification. That's doing the ancient peoples down. We're not giving them their due credit. They do not mean that there is literally water surrounding the material realm. They were aware of the stars also. They could read the stars better than any of us. They could use the stars for navigation. They were aware, okay, that there were things beyond this world, that there was a material world that went into the sky and beyond, okay. And they show this, of course, when they discuss the fact there are 9 realms. There were obviously other things beyond our world. So they showed a knowledge that there were other things beyond this world, this existence. And so when they say that Midgard is surrounded by water, they are not being ignorant. They're not saying we're surrounded by literal water. They are simply using the words and the language that they had at the time to describe what they had, some of them had gained experience of. Now, I've had a similar experience to probably what all the druids and shamans have had in past times, because to become a druid and a shaman, you would have to undergo what's sometimes called the walking death or the waking dream. This is where basically you die, but don't stay dead. You come back. You resuscitate yourself, in essence. You come back. You go to the spiritual realm in part and come back through a death-like experience. Now, in my death-like experience, and I've described this in the video that I filmed prior to this, I experienced what it's like to return to the material realm from the spiritual realm. And when I left Asgard, Folkvangir, where I went to, I had to pass through what I could only describe as a black water that split the spiritual and material realms apart. At the time, I didn't draw 1 + 1 = 2, but this is, of course, the water that is being described in ancient pagan stories of water surrounding Midgard. The water is a transitional element between the spirit and the material realm, and it is what ultimately separates the realms and keeps them at different planar levels. But it connects them in a way that allows some degree of travel. The reason as such is that these waters are not just material in nature, they are spiritual also. They have dual qualities, because the spiritual and the material, they can't collide, they cannot pass over into one another. But through these waters, potentially, they can. And this is where we see interactions between the spiritual realms and our material realm, and I'll get into how that would happen in a bit. But ultimately, what I'm trying to say is this water that is supposedly surrounding Midgard is not a water. It's just what our language is limited to describing, whatever it does surround the material realm, at a level that is between ourselves and the spiritual realm. Now, this is not Gununganap. I used to think that it was Gununganap that split the two realms, the spiritual and the material realm. It's not. The water is something else. It is something that is just a production of both, as I say, the spiritual and material aspects. And instead, where we see Gununganap still existing is, of course, at the boundaries of our own material realms, and possibly also at the boundaries of the spiritual realms. They may still be expanding also, but of course that is something that we cannot answer. Now, where did these waters come from? Have they always been there? No, they have not, but they've been there for a very long time. These waters come from that collision that I described earlier. So when Muspelheim and the Niflheim came and met, their boundaries met, they collided with one another, and what do you get when fire meets ice? You get fire melting ice and ice quenching fire, but ultimately, whichever way round it happens, or whichever way round you describe it, you get water. And so the waters that surround Midgard are in fact the waters, for want of a better word, that were created from the interaction between both Muspelheim and Niflheim. And it's the perfect medium to put the material realm in, because of course the material realm then begins to reflect the destructive nature of Muspelheim, but also the pure creative nature of Niflheim. And we see this not only within us, but the world around us. There is death, but there is also life. There is creation, but there is also destruction. There is a potential for both. Now, our human nature, the reason it has a duality to it, why we can do good or evil in, the Christian sense of things, or I'll say the creative and the destructive side of things, the reason we can be both is because, of course, we are created from Ymir himself, who had not only the potential to be and was the most creative of all the gods, but he was also the first and most destructive of also all the gods. So he had a dual nature to himself. But I believe some of the duality not only comes from him, but the reason why the natural world around us also has a dual nature to it, a cruel side, but also a nurturing side, is because the waters in which we have been created, where the corpse of Ymir was placed by Odin and Vili and Ve, this has both aspects of Muspelheim and Niflheim incorporated within it. And so really what we're going to discuss now is going to be, why was Midgard placed within the waters between the two realms? Why was the material realm founded here, or at least Ymir found his corpse placed here? And so, in my opinion, the realm of Midgard, as I say, it was created within these waters. These waters gave birth to the material realm of Midgard, and within Midgard was placed, of course, the corpse of Ymir, which then gave birth to us when Odin carved us from the driftwood that he found, essentially from the Ymir's corpse. And this is why Midgard is the only material realm. It is the only part of all of reality that has been created from both creation and destruction through a collision of realms, and it became disjointed. It is no longer in the same planes of the spiritual realms. And so what we're going to look at now is instead, where did the other realms come from? If the first three realms were Muspelheim and Niflheim, and then the creation of Midgard from their collision, and then from the placing of Ymir's corpse within the realm, where did the other realms appear? Now, what's important to, of course, understand from what I described there is that the realm of Midgard, not Earth, okay, i.e., the corpse of Ymir, but the realm of Midgard was created not by Odin, Vili, and Ve, as what most people believe. It was instead, as I say, created by the natural process of the spiritual realms, the two spiritual realms that existed at the time, expanding and colliding into one another, and the resultant waters, if that's the, we'll just call them waters. I'm sure that it's something very different, but that those waters that were created is essentially that what then gave birth to the realm of Midgard within those waters. Now, how Midgard came about from those waters is something I don't have an answer to, but this is where Midgard was found. Then, of course, we progress through the cosmology story into the creation of Earth itself, i.e., what we would normally consider to be Midgard. All pagans know that, of course, Midgard comes from the corpse of Ymir. Ymir being the first of all the gods, not just of the giants, but of all the gods. A god who became jealous of the other gods, the Asgardians, ultimately, or what are essentially the Aesir at this point, the Aesir tribe of gods. He became jealous of essentially the fact that they were beautiful. They were, divine in the true aspect of it, in presentation, in their goodness, so on and so forth. Whereas Ymir was potentially, you could argue, grotesque. But he had a beauty to him that he could not see. For he was the only god to have ever existed in all of time that had the power to create life without having to have a counterpart. He could create life by himself. Odin, for example, as powerful as he is, still needed a wife, right? And so did his father and his father's father. And so we see literal, pure creation within Ymir. As he moved around, as he lived, he created and spawned life. And so even though, yes, he looked like a mountain and so on and so forth, and he may have become jealous of the gods, he became blinded by that jealousy. He couldn't see the beauty within himself, within the abilities that he had. And these abilities made him loved by the other gods. And so it was with a heavy heart that Odin, Vili, and Ve needed to make a preemptive strike upon Ymir, for he was going to be, you could tell, the gods knew that he was going to become highly destructive. He was going to act out on his jealousy and destroy pretty much everything within sight. And so Odin and Vili and Ve, the three brothers, decided to instead make a preemptive strike, as I say, upon Ymir. And it worked. They killed Ymir. But in their sadness from having killed what they saw as the most magnificent, most admirable, most, as I say, beautiful of all the gods, in their sadness for doing such a horrific act in their own eyes, they believed that they should have Ymir spawn one more set of life. From his death, life must come anew. That concept of creation leading to, or destruction in this case, leading into creation. This was something that Odin, Vili, and Ve wished to conceive. And so they took his corpse and placed it within the realm of Midgard, within the waters that had been created from the collision between Muspelheim and Niflheim. And here they forged what essentially is what we call Earth now. They forged the true Midgard. They formed it from all his body parts. His skull became the sky, his blood became the waters, his hair the vegetation, so on and so forth. And this is the important bit, of course, because then this is where we see the creation of man. But this is not what we're discussing at the moment. Because what happened was, when the Midgard, within the realm of Midgard, but Midgard Earth, was created, little did Odin, Vili, and Ve know that they were going to inadvertently create the other realms. As I say, Ymir was pure creation, and even in his death he was able to spout not only new life, but new realms. And what happened was, through the creation of Midgard, through the reshaping ultimately of Ymir's corpse into Midgard, we find the birth of Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil did not exist at this point in time, and the flow of fate, because essentially that's what Yggdrasil is, it is a spiritual connection between all the realms that ultimately allows the fates to flow from source, i.e. the realms, as ultimately through all of the 9 realms to be recycled again for reuse. Prior to this point, fate flowed simply between the 2 realms of Muspelheim and Niflheim. It had no real need to, of course, go anywhere else, and simple flow between the realms was enough. But Yggdrasil, as I say, was born. It found itself born within this destructive but then creative act of using Ymir's corpse to form Midgard. His corpse sprouted the roots beneath and the branches above of Yggdrasil. And it was then Yggdrasil allowing fate to flow elsewhere beyond the 2 original spirit realms that then saw the creation of the other 6 realms. The realms of Alfheim, the realms of Asgard, the realms of Vanenheim, the realms of Jotunheim, the realm of Helheim, and lastly the realm of Svartalfheim. These all came into creation via the roots in regards to the latter 3 and the branches of Yggdrasil. And it is the action of fate now being able to flow into other areas of essentially what was Gununganap at the time, into other areas that then sprouted the birth of new realms. That's important because, as we see, the gods themselves, apart from Ymir, of course, he's the only exception to this, but the other gods themselves cannot create realms. They placed Ymir's corpse within the realm of Midgard, which was created for the collision of the realms. And then the other realms themselves, the other 6 realms, were then created through the birth of Yggdrasil from Ymir's corpse and the flow of fate into Gununganap. And that flow of fate into Gununganap transformed the void of nothingness, of absolute nothingness, into something. Into all the realms that now we of course understand as pagans. And of course these realms then expanded within the space that they had, and expanded into one another, and formed the boundaries between the realms, of course, that exist as we know. And the same rules applied to these realms. They were spiritual in nature, because of course they probably were born of the spirit of Ymir, the body of Ymir, that formed Earth, that formed Midgard. But his spirit gave birth, as I say, his consciousness perhaps, this is what gave, or his pure creative power, this gave birth to Yggdrasil, and then ultimately, consequently, as a result, the realms themselves. And so these realms are, of course, of a spiritual nature, because they come from the spirit, or the consciousness of Ymir. And these realms were split into 2. The good side of Ymir, essentially the creative aspects of Ymir, forming the heavens and the branches, and the destructive elements of Ymir, this other side to his personality that was born of jealousy, forming the roots, ultimately, of Ymir, where of course we find Helheim, Svartalfheim, and Jotunheim, the more destructive of all the realms. As I say, these realms, being spiritual in nature, were bound by the same rules of expansion that Muspelheim and Niflheim found themselves bound by. and that is that their borders could not encroach into the other spiritual realms. Now, of course, there was no interaction between their collision of these realms that we know of, because, of course, they were not elemental in nature. They were just variations of pretty much the same thing. And so there's no formation of new waters or anything like this, new planes at least that we know of, but they was, as I say, a collision between the boundaries to the point where it's halted expansion of the realms once they got to a certain point. However, we do not see expansion or interaction between the spiritual realms and, of course, our own material realm. The waters that surround Midgard, imagine Midgard as a sphere or something along those lines. It's a three-dimensional structure. The waters that completely envelop the realm of Midgard, as I say, are both of spiritual and physical nature. These waters prevent interaction between the spiritual realm and the material realm. However, of course, we know that there are interactions between these realms. In fact, there had to be. For Ymir's corpse to be placed within Midgard, there needed to be at least certain paths that the spiritual realms could use to interact or at least visit the material realm, and of course the other way around, as man came along and became aware of the spirit worlds. Now, the most important ones of these to consider, of course, the two bridges. The two bridges, of course, being the Bifrost that connects Asgard with Midgard, and Galdabru. Galdabru is the bridge that most people don't know of that connects in a similar manner that Bifrost does Helheim with Midgard. Now, what these bridges are to me are not constructions of the gods. These are instead permanent constructs that were formed within the trunk of Yggdrasil. So as Yggdrasil was born, its roots descended downwards into Helheim, directly beneath Midgard, and directly above Midgard, of course, is Asgard itself. And this connection between, just imagine almost water flowing through the tree, from the roots of a tree to its utmost branches. This connection is what forms the bridges and allows ultimately the spiritual realms of Asgard and Helheim to interact directly with the realm of Midgard. Now, of course, this is the easiest way for the gods of Asgard to travel to Midgard. In fact, they use the Bifrost to in fact do this. It's the only real way that they can do it. But there are other ways, of course, in which they can visit Midgard. And of course, that also applies between the spirit realms also. But we find in a lot of the prose and Eddas accounts and stories of Odin, who of course was very much a traveller god. He travelled to Midgard and between the realms in pursuit of knowledge, of the ultimate wisdom in essence. And in his travels he would often visit Midgard and use Midgard as a way station ultimately to then enter the other spiritual realms. So there may not actually be the sort of direct travel ultimately between the spirit realms, or it may be quite difficult or long-winded to do. It seems to be a much quicker way for the gods to simply descend into Midgard and then go from Midgard into another realm, because what happens is that Odin quite commonly visits realms such as Svartalfheim, which was one of the realms that has been known for him to visit through Midgard, and the realm of Helheim, of course, also. And they visit Odin visited these realms by first, as I say, coming down to Midgard and then using secret paths that only he had learnt about, that only he knew about, that then connected Midgard to the other spirit realms. And so my understanding and belief behind this is that the waters that surround Midgard, there are breaks in it, or there are perhaps like almost fords, if you know what I mean, between the spirit realm and all the spirit realms and Midgard itself. And so Midgard, if you know the secret paths, if you know how to travel and where to find and how to open these paths, because often they need to be opened with, some form of Galdar magic, then of course Midgard makes the perfect midway station. And this is exactly what Odin does, and it certainly would allow him to travel um, um, much more secretively, because if these are paths that no one knows about other than himself and maybe just a tiny fraction of other people, then this, or other gods in this case, then this is a perfect way of traveling in the secret pursuit of knowledge and wisdom that you simply don't want to share with the other gods. Because of course, when he has visited Helheim, he could have simply just gone to Helheim using the two bridges that I described. That being, of course, the bridges of Bifrost and Galabru. However, despite the fact that Midgard is surrounded by waters that are of a transient nature, sort of transitional nature, if you wish, between the spirit and the material realm, ultimately acting as a blockade, yes, there are some gaps, but we do see sometimes, from time to time, and it's not like permanent interactions, they're transient interactions. Spirit realms do sometimes overlap with the material realm. Now, of course, this is impossible between spirit realm and spirit realm. Spirit realm collides with another spirit realm if they try to expand into one another. But there seems to be a waxing and a waning between the spirit realms and, of course, Midgard itself. And the spirit realms occasionally can wax onto the material realm and allow interactions between the spiritual realm and the material realm of Midgard. And we see this very commonly, for example, areas of burial, grave sites and stuff like this. This is quite a common place to find Helheim expanding into the material realm, and a permanent connection, or certainly a semi-permanent connection, can be made at these sort of locations. This is where we see a true interaction between the realms, and so it may be that the sort of protective barrier, if that's how you wish to call it, of the waters between the realms, of course, can change in accordance to energies that can build up within Midgard, or perhaps there is a current within the waters that surround, of course, Midgard, and these currents can sometimes leave, less of a barrier than there would otherwise be, which is small enough for then the realms to just slightly cross over for a short period of time. And so when we look at this, when we look at accounts of, like, sort of the sort of mythological creatures, if you wish, of paganistic viewpoints and beliefs, such as the pixies and the trolls and so on and so forth, and interaction directly with giants, we do see, of course, and we know of interactions between the realms of Jotunheim in account for the giants with our own world. Spirit and material can overlap and interact with one another, but as I say, it is typically a transient nature or very isolated nature. But there are permanent paths between Midgard, the material, and the spiritual realms, as Odin had, of course, shown. But you need to know where they are, and you need to know the secrets on how to open those paths, or at least make them open for a short period of time, if not permanently. This, of course, being a complete contrast between the boundaries of the spirit realms. Yes, it is possible to go from one spirit realm to another. We see this many a time when, of course, the gods, for example, when they go on expedition for Loki. Well, I know it's Thor and Loki. I don't. Maybe Balder went with them. They went to one of the other realms. I think it was Jotunheim, and they used the path between the spirit realms, and then they were pursued by a giant, turned into a giant eagle, and they returned to Asgard, and this eagle followed them by flying to Asgard. So the travel between the spirit realms is definitely, of course, possible, but But of course, those realms do not invade one another. The essences of what makes those realms, the borders that form between them, are there regardless. The realms cannot encroach onto each other when they're in the same plane. And this, of course, happens, as I say, because they're in the same plane. Unlike the spiritual realms in when they interact with the material realm, the reason they can interact with our realm because they can overlap, because they're not on the same plane. Okay, guys, I know that was quite a heavy discussion there, and I'm sure I've probably missed a few bits out, which I can always do a second video on. If there's any clarifications you want me to make, any ideas that you want to share, any questions, or just debates that you want to bring up, please put them in the comment section, and I'll see you soon. So thanks for watching, guys. Bye bye.